In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and all that was in them. Then God looked over all he had made, and God saw that it was very good. The story of creation in Genesis tells of God creating the creatures of the water and the creatures of the air and the creatures of the land. God creates Adam and places him in a garden with clear instructions on what he can eat. And then God creates Eve to be a partner to Adam. Then Adam and Eve eat fruit from a forbidden tree. And where before they were unaware of their nakedness, after they ate from the forbidden tree, they became ashamed of their nakedness. Where before they enjoyed a sort of guileless relationship with God, now they were hiding. And where before they had peace in their relationship with each other, after they ate from the forbidden tree, they blamed each other for their mistakes. And so the Lord God banished them from the Garden of Eden and sent Adam out to cultivate the ground from which he had been made. This story is at the beginning of the first book in our Old Testament. It's the beginning of the beginning. And later, after Jesus has lived and died and the church is born, a letter is written to a body of believers in Rome. And in one part, the author, probably the Apostle Paul, references this Adam and Eve story, saying, yes, Adam's one sin brings condemnation for everyone, but Christ's one act of righteousness brings a right relationship with God and new life for everyone. Because one person disobeyed God, many became sinners. But because one other person obeyed God, many will be made righteous. The author here is drawing a connection between Adam and Jesus. And where sin came into the world through one person, Adam, and then affected all of humanity, freedom from sin also comes through one person, Jesus, and is offered to all of humanity. I find a lot of hope in this passage that this new life is for everyone. But this passage, alongside other verses like all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory, and there's no one righteous, not even one, they've been used to build a doctrine that we call original sin. Now, I think all of us can look around and we see pain. We see brokenness in our world. We see ways that we've hurt people and have been hurt by other people. And another word for that might be sin. And original sin is responding to that question, where does this pain come from? Where does sin come from? With the answer that it comes from our ancient ancestors, Adam and Eve, and it's passed on to every human from birth. We're in week 3 of a series that we're calling God Speaks Science. And in this series, we're working to learn the language of faith and the language of science. Science and faith are 2 different languages that can work together to say the same thing and add a depth to our understanding and experience of God. We hope that we'll discover a richness in speaking both languages that draws us closer to God, because God is, after all, the creator of all, including science and everything we learn through science. So we started week 1 with a message, what I wish the church knew about being a scientist. And last week, we had a message, reading the word in the world. This week, we're talking about science and original sin. And next week, we'll wrap up this series with a conversation on where humans come from. Now, believe it or not, I'm pretty excited about this message. Pastor Tom and I have had numerous conversations about original sin over the past couple of years. And when we were exploring a website called BioLogos, which is a website devoted to the intersection of faith and science for inspiration on this topic, we came across an article about theories for original sin. And because Pastor Tom knew how I had been wrestling with this topic, he suggested I write this message so that I can work to articulate what I believe and where I'm at. So I'm going to tell you that this is a rather autobiographical message. What I'm going to share is not necessarily the final authority on original sin. In fact, I know that there are places in here that Pastors Tom and Mark would want to clarify or adjust. This is just a snapshot of where I'm at right now in my journey. It's not where I was before, and it may not be where I'm at in the future. But for those of you who have had a similar faith foundation, you may relate to a lot of what I share. And for those of you who have had a different faith background, I hope that you'll grow in compassion for those of us who have struggled with this concept of original sin. Now, maybe you're wondering what original sin and science have to do with each other. Today we're going to explore two aspects of original sin in science. First, through natural science on one hand, and then through psychology on the other. So we're going to use these things to talk about where sin comes from. Let's start with natural science, which is a branch of science that deals with the physical world. Now, I'm leaning here on an article by Lauren Haarsma from biologos.com called Why the Church Needs Multiple Theories of Original Sin. Haarsma has a PhD from Harvard and did 5 years of postdoctoral research in neuroscience. And in this article, Haarsma reflects on what happens when a Christian examines the evidence that God used evolution to create human beings. Now, I just want to quickly note here that according to Biologos, there's very little debate in the scientific community about this broad characterization of evolution. And anyone who claims otherwise is either uninformed or deliberately trying to mislead. And that's from What is Evolution? You can go check out that article for more information on that. Now, among the first questions a Christian might ask after wrestling with evolution is, well, what about Adam and Eve? If sin came into the world through Adam and Eve, but humans were created as a result of evolution, then where did sin come from? Now, next week, Pastors Mark and Tom are going to have that conversation, a message that specifically focuses on whether there was a literal Adam and Eve and where humans come from. So I don't want to answer that question today. So whether Adam and Eve were literal humans through whom sin entered the world, I do believe that Haarsma's theories can help us to consider how sin entered the world with some new insight. So first scenario, Adam and Eve are recent representatives of humanity. In this scenario, Adam and Eve lived relatively recently, like a few thousand years ago. They're two literal people who have had an important interaction with God that leads to sin entering the world. But they're part of like a larger group of people. So they're not necessarily ancestors of humanity, but they are representatives of humanity. And as our representatives, their disobedience caused all of humanity to fall into sin. Scenario 2, Adam and Eve are ancient representative ancestors of humanity. In this, Adam and Eve lived many thousands of years ago. They're representative ancestors in that they were probably part of a group of people, maybe a tribe, but they also have a sort of ancestor kind of relationship with much of humanity. And in this circumstance, there would be a fairly distinct before and after in relationship to sin in the world. And then scenario 3, Adam and Eve's story in Genesis is a symbolic retelling of every human story. So here they're symbolic. They're retelling the story of every human who, over our long history, became aware of God's claims on how they ought to live and then disobeyed. Here, Adam and Eve are strictly symbolic and are invitations for us to reflect on our own lives rather than to look to the past. So these are different ways that we can take our understanding of scientific evolution and still hold on to the idea of original sin. And Haarsma suggests that we resist the urge to rush to a conclusion of which one of these makes most sense and let us live in the tension. Just as we have multiple theories for atonement, which is to say what actually happened for humanity when Jesus came to earth in the incarnation, lived, died, and was resurrected, it's appropriate for us to have multiple theories on the origin of sin. Okay, so that's our natural science approach to original sin. Brief overview, in part because it's really hard to go too much deeper into this topic without getting into a discussion on the origins of humanity. But before we move on to considering original sin from a human psychology and development perspective, let's pause here for a chat question. So if you're joining us online, put it in the chat or turn to someone around you. When you reflect on the different theories on original sin, which one catches your interest? Which one do you want to ask more questions about? Recent representatives, ancient representative ancestors, or symbolic? Take a minute and talk about it.